back up with the revolution in Mexico. At the turn of the 20th century, Mexico was also under a very controlling dictatorship. The guy who led Mexico around the turn of the 20th century was this man here, Porfirio Diaz. We're going to see that Mexico is a very good example of a country that is really struggling to get that sort of self-determination that Woodrow Wilson still, was pushing for after World War I. Most of the country's resources were under the control of foreign investors, specifically from the United States. So again, we definitely see a hindering of this sense of self-determination, and it sort of brings into question whether self-determination was something that was really meant for maybe European countries, people who were more white in nature. So Diaz, you could certainly compare him to someone like Stalin in the sense that he also tries to suppress any opposition to his power. And so there is an opposition candidate against him named Francisco Madero. We see him here in the middle. And Diaz actually has him thrown in jail to try to, again, suppress any opposition. But Diaz was not particularly popular, and Francisco Madero had a pretty good following. And so when he has Francisco Madero thrown in jail, there are going to be revolutions that break out in northern Mexico among Madero supporters. Madero escapes from jail, and then he sets up revolutionary offices in El Paso. So again, there's going to be this revolution sort of stemming from the north. In 1911, Madero's troops, who were under the command of Francisco Pancho Villa, here's Pancho Villa here, end up defeating Mexican troops. They send Diaz into exile, and then Madero is elected president in 1911. You're going to see a series of leaders and governments that follow this initial revolutionary victory, but the idea is that by 1911, you're going to have an overthrow of this more tightly controlled dictatorial government, and one that is meant to be more democratic in nature, one that is in some ways meant to sort of mimic some of the Western democracies. After the revolution, we should focus in on this gentleman here, Emiliano Zapata. He was one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution that instilled Madero in power. He works to promote land distribution programs, so to give more land to the peasants. Basically, under the time of Diaz, about 97% of the land in Mexico was controlled by the wealthiest 1% of the population. And so leaders of the revolution like Zapata are going to try to change that by redistributing land. Again, note the similarities between this and a place like Russia. Okay, it may not necessarily be as extreme, but the idea still is that this revolution is meant to be more democratic, meant to sort of lessen the gap between the rich and the poor, rather. In 1917, Mexico writes a new constitution, and again, this one is much more democratic. The Constitution sets many goals for the future of Mexico. One of them is to redistribute land, as Zapata was pushing for. Also universal suffrage, and also trying to promote public education. So again, you see how the new Constitution for Mexico in 1917 is very much influenced by a lot of Western countries that also push for these things. Right, as you remember, this is around the same time that universal suffrage, so including women voting, is getting established in countries like England and the United States. So Mexico is also pushing for these things. The goals of the 1917 Constitution are not all achieved right away, but what is important is that they still find their way into the Constitution. And also, the Mexican Constitution actually is going to have an influence back in Europe. The Weimar Constitution, which is under development at the end of World War I, is going to actually take some provisions from the Mexican Constitution. And also the Russian Constitution of 1918 is somewhat based on the Mexican Constitution. Oh, sorry, back here. Lázaro Cárdenas. He's, again, another major Mexican revolutionary. He actually is able to promote some more successful land reform. he also works to nationalize the oil industry. And this is going to be something that really angers foreign investors, right? Prior to the nationalization of the oil industry, the oil industry was basically controlled by private investors. So you actually had some favorable deals between the owners of oil companies and particularly investors in the United States, right? They had a major demand for Mexican oil. So by nationalizing the oil, the Mexican government takes over the oil industry. And so this is going to be less favorable towards foreign traders. So, again, this is something that shows us that the Mexicans certainly believe in the idea of self-determination that Wilson was pushing forward, but it seems like many U.S. investors actually do not really want to guarantee that right to the Mexicans. In terms of the social hierarchy, though, we don't really see a dramatic change. So again, the Constitution of 1917 makes, sort of talks about some more progress for social equality in Mexico, but this is a slower process. In China as well, we are experiencing a revolutionary period. As you know, you can make a comparison between China and Russia here in the early 20th century in the sense that, again, a fairly long-standing dynastic system is going to collapse, right? So, like in Russia, we know the Romanovs collapsed. In China, the Qing dynasty is going to fall in 1911, and it's going to be replaced by the Republic of China, which is led by this gentleman here in the far left, Sun Yat-sen. The First Republic of China is not very strong, right? For the most part, China is still controlled by warlords who are still influencing a specific region. And so eventually the warlords are actually going to oust Sun Yat-sen. He's only president of the Chinese Republic for about a year. So basically what we see is, first off, one of the major flaws of the Chinese Republic is that they don't really have a national army. So because of that, regional armies still exist. So by lacking that sort of standardization of the military, it's very difficult to establish and also keep in power a central government. China, just like many other countries, are really disappointed by the results of the Paris Peace Conference. Urban intellectuals and Chinese college students were really hoping that they would get more independence from Western European control. As you remember, China was divided into spheres of influence during the age of imperialism. And what we see is that instead of kind of getting rid of these major spheres of influence, the big four, the people who were negotiating the Paris Peace Conference, actually just say, all right, well, Germany was defeated. Germany, up until World War I, their sphere of influence was in this little dotted region here, the Shandong province. So basically what happens is that the people in the Paris Peace Conference obviously take that province away from the Germans, but instead of giving it back to the Chinese, they actually give it to the Japanese, right? So this is very problematic because, again, you see that this totally goes against the idea of self-determination. You might ask, why did the Japanese get it? Well, a major reason why that is because the Japanese were a pretty significant ally to Western powers during World War I. So basically, the Japanese get control over Shandong province, and this sets an important precedent because what we see moving forward here is that the Japanese continue to become really aggressive against China, and as we know, by the 1930s, they take control of Manchuria in 1931, and then in 1937 they invade Nanking. So basically we're going to see that the Japanese are going to exert some major imperial control over China, and you could say that the Paris Peace Conference sort of sets this up by giving them Shandong province. You're also going to see that the Treaty of Versailles was received in a very negative way by many Chinese intellectuals. So revolts actually are going to result from that. The May 4th movement is the best example of that revolt. It's going to be a bunch of student protests against the occupation of Shandong province. So again, notice the sort of the trend that we see here. It seems like every time there is an attempt to have foreign influence over Chinese policy, there's major backlash against a lot of times students, young intellectuals. And so probably not surprisingly to you, many of these people are going to get really attracted to the Communist Party that starts to emerge in this period, and of course gains strength once we get further through the 20th century. So basically, just like the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, we keep on seeing these pushes away from Western influence, from imperialism. And so it's not surprising that they turn towards a completely different system, a system that most of these imperial powers are against, right? They don't like communism. So the Chinese are attracted to something that goes against this Western imperialism. Again, like I was saying before, China also experiences a civil war in the 20th century. This goes beyond just post World War I. This also continues until after World War II. But I figured let's just talk about the whole thing so we get a sense of the continuity in China in the 20th century. So basically, what we have is that there are going to be two major political parties that emerge in China: the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, which was led by Mao Zedong. We know that Mao Zedong eventually will become the communist leader of China after the Communist Party takes over. Mao Zedong was really trying to base a communist revolution on the revolt of peasants. Again, the peasants make up the vast majority of China's population. They, in many ways, are the most dissatisfied with the current political climate and the current economy. And so he wanted to rouse up the support of peasants in order to establish a communist government. One thing that's also interesting is that, as we know, peasants obviously have a much more rural existence. And so we see, just like with the Soviet Union, they kind of are adapting Marxist principles to work for their unique economy, right? The Russian government as well, or the Russian society as well, was mainly agrarian. And so basically Lenin and Stalin kind of take communist principles and apply it towards a society that was different from what Marx imagined. Marx was looking at an economy that was much more already urban, right, in nature. So basically Mao's doing that too. He's trying to take the rural workers and get them to rise up against against a more nationalist economy. The second party that is fighting for power is the Chinese Nationalist Party. That's also called the Kuomintang, or KMT is the abbreviation. This was led by Chiang Kai-shek. And his goal also was to try to unite China under one party. But Chiang Kai-shek does not really trust communism. And so what we're going to experience is that there's an initial attempt to kind of unite China as a whole. But then these two parties clash enough that they end up going to civil war with one another. And this starts in 1927. What we're going to see is that different worldwide powers are going to take sides in this conflict. Not surprisingly, the Soviets are going to ally with the Communist Party, and the U.S. is going to ally with the Nationalist Party. So basically, you're going to see that there's going to be foreign influence trying to control the result of the Civil War. As we get closer to World War II, the Civil War does stop temporarily because, as you can see, or as you probably know, Japan is becoming increasingly aggressive, seizing territory in China. So basically, the Communists and Nationalists stop fighting for almost 10 years and start to fight the Japanese. But when the Second World War ends in 1945, the Civil War is going to continue, right? And the Communists and Nationalists fight against one another again. The Long March is a good event to be familiar with to get a sense of how the Communist Party is rising to power. In the 1920s, still, the Nationalist Party was much more powerful than the Communists. In 1927, the Nationalist Party almost defeated the Communists, and they basically forced the Communists to retreat into China's interior. So the Communists were in Jiangxi province down here, but basically when the Kuomintang almost defeats them, they are forced to go on this very long retreat, and this is called the Long March. And the Long March took many, many years. Okay, it takes. I mean, at this point, we're talking over 10 years. The Long March was about a 6,000-mile journey to northern China. And basically the idea was, for Mao to try to continue to avoid the Kuomintang's advances. But also it gave us a sense of the sort of the survivalist nature of the Communist Party, right? Many people were lost in the Long March. About 80,000 communists started the Long March, but by the time the Long March ended in northern China in 1935, there were only about 10,000 left. But still, at the same time, the fact that Mao, survived this Long March, the fact that he still did have many followers with him that reached northern China, did cause many people to sort of support and celebrate the possibility that the Communist Party could become victorious. This also leads to the emergence of Mao as the new leader of the Communist Party. So basically what the Long March does is it brings a lot of popularity and admiration to the Communist Party, and this is going to give it strength. Again, we're going to see that as the Sino-Japanese War starts in 1937, there's going to be a brief reuniting of the two political parties. I said that in a previous slide. But yeah, what we're going to see is that the Chinese Nationalist Party, by many, the United States, not so much because they wanted to have a nationalist, a non-communist economy. Many people saw the Kuomintang as sort of out of touch with the diverse needs of the Chinese people. The Kuomintang continued to advocate Confucianism, for example, but at this point, the old traditions were no longer popular. Also, Chiang Kai-shek tried to suppress free speech when he received criticism, and in general, the nationalist government was seen as corrupt, and it alienated a lot of Chinese urban intellectuals. So again, as we see, there's that happening, that the Nationalist Party is sort of losing a lot of popular support. And then we have the Japanese expansion into China in the 1930s, which really weakens the country. So again, in 1935, the Nationalists and Communists sort of suspend their own war to fight against Japan. But in 1945, the Japanese are going to be defeated in World War II. And so the Communists and Nationalists resume their fight for China. And again, by 1949, the Communist Party is going to emerge as victorious. They defeat the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party is forced to flee to Taiwan. And then the Communist Party of China is going to rule. Technically, China is still communist in terms of political power, not so much in terms of its economic function now. But this is going to lead to a major souring of the relationship between China and a lot of Western countries. And effectively, Harry Truman, the president of the United States at the time, argues that they lost China to the Cold War. So that's the end of these revolutions that are taking place in different parts of the world. We're going to talk about some other non-Western places. We'll talk about Turkey, we'll talk about India, and we'll talk about some places in Africa and then Latin America in the future videos. So stay tuned for those, and thanks.